And so a lot of you may know some of this stuff. I mean, Barbara, people who work on computational semantics, word embedding models, but I'm just going to walk through some of those concepts and how they kind of work in intellectual history, basically, which is fun for me because so much of my work is really in literature. My PhD is in English literature. And, what I do is sometimes called distant reading. Everyone knows this term. It comes from literature, contrasted with close reading. But one interesting thing is that, it's still controversial for its abstraction, its quantification. Like we're not looking at the kind of context of a particular work. We're abstracting some feature of that work and then historicizing that feature or something like that. And I don't know if it's cute, but I think it's interesting that the history of ideas has been controversial for similar reasons. And people have critiqued that, at least in the kind of old-fashioned Arthur C. Lovejoy history of an idea. The idea that an idea is not a historically contextualized entity. Like an idea doesn't exist outside of its context. So there's a kind of argument within history against this type of history of ideas. But one thing that I think is interesting for those of us who work on text is that, I think around the 70s, people like Quentin Skinner, Reinhard Koselleck, Raymond Williams were doing intellectual history where they really focus not on an idea, but on the interface between a word and an idea. There's a lexical basis to it, even to the extent that in Raymond Williams keywords. I wish I could remove this. So a lot of these projects are dictionary based. So Raymond Williams has a book called Keywords that is just literally organized alphabetically. And just as an example, so this is kind of part of his history of the word culture, which is a very important word for him. And basically he traces it, from a kind of, effectively a word for agriculture. It's a tending of natural growth, but then by analogy, it moves to a process of human cultivation, an intellectual cultivation, a general state or habit of the mind, and then, kind of abstracts even further into the intellectual development of a society as a whole. So he's telling these stories about words, kind of ideas, and using that history of the word to look at the history of society. So he pins the explanation for a lot of these words on industrialization, urbanization, and so forth. So we can get to the methods behind this in a minute, but this is the kind of stuff I've been doing. So here are the most similar words to culture from 1720 to 1900. And you do see, supposedly, according to this model, plants is the most similar word to culture. Gardening, vegetation, soils, planting, cultivating, and so forth. The gray words here are the first time they're introduced. And so you start to see words later on like industry, intellectual, learning, enlightenment, education, and so forth. So you see something like the transition Williams is talking about between agriculture and intellectual cultivation. One more that'll come in, that I'll come back to is a kind of silly one. This is the word station. And, somewhere around the mid-19th century, you get, road, carriage, junction, tram, railway, effectively with the invention of the railway. Earlier, I studied the 18th century mainly, and station's a very important word for class, basically, one station in life. So I think this is interesting because not all of these changes are going to be semantic changes necessarily. This is effectively a technological change, but one that kind of overtook a word, so this word becomes more predominantly used to refer to a railway train as opposed to earlier. Okay, so it's really interesting, and we'll keep doing it, looking at individual words. But something I want to kind of focus on is both Williams and Koselleck kind of hazard more general hypotheses about the changes in a lot of words. And particularly in this very important period, the late 18th and early 19th century, this revolutionary period, the American Revolution, the Jacobin revolutions elsewhere, of course, in France. where they argue that, so as Williams says, in the last decades of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th, a number of words which are of capital importance came for the first time into common English usage, or where they had already been used, acquired new and important meanings. And then Koselleck is even stronger. Since the middle of the 18th century, profound changes occurred in the meaning of the classical topics of political discourse. What is posited is the emergence of a threshold period, Sattelzeit. So he hypothesizes that this period is one in which there's an unusually high degree of semantic change. He calls this the semantic threshold of modernity. So modernity begins semantically in this period. I mean, it's a gigantic hypothesis. And it's one that, you would expect to see in the data. So we'll look at that hypothesis. Is it the case that this period is unusual in this regard? Another interesting thing they hypothesize is that there's a kind of general direction to a lot of these words in their change. And the way I'm putting it is towards a greater abstraction. I mean, Williams doesn't say it quite so much, but he says there's a general pattern. And then, a lot of the words he looks at kind of spell out that general pattern. So labor going from the individual toil of something to labor, capital, labor. It's an abstraction about the economy. Industry really means industriousness, one's own industry, until it becomes a collective word for manufacturing. Art, one is basically a synonym for skill before it becomes the institution of art. And culture, we've already looked at. So there's a kind of, you see things like economization, like something moving from the individual to the social, a kind of greater abstraction. Like these are the types of general trends in the change of meaning that they are hypothesizing exist here. Koselleck again goes even farther and kind of names it. So Koselleck does say many older concepts, that increasingly overtaken by events or changes in social structures that they could no longer either articulate or explain, became more and more abstract. And from that time on, the use of collective singular nouns proliferated. So he even gives us a kind of syntactic argument here. So instead of stories or histories in the plural, we get history. And that's his kind of master key. I think for Williams, culture is the most important word. For Koselleck, it's history. And he argues that it's not until the French Revolution where something completely unprecedented in history happens that the modern notion of history as a singular entity that's moving in a direction, as opposed to histories that are repeating, takes place. So we're looking for things like singularization. We're looking for things like abstraction, this move from the individual to the collective, and so forth. So I'm just taking those as hypotheses. And we can kind of squeeze the hypothesis into a more computational setting, which by just asking, did an unusually many number of words undergo some kind of acceleration of semantic change during this period? So in order to do that, we need some way to measure the degree of semantic change, some way to say that this word changed more in its meaning than some other word. And that we can use word embedding models. And who is anyone familiar with this already? Yeah. I mean, so, the basic idea, as with a lot of stuff in digital humanities, it's, empirical. It's based on a corpus. So this is, I think, just historical American English. But if I take the word culture and if I count up the words that often occur with culture, then I can operationalize the similarity of culture to another word by the similarity of the words that surround those words. And this is a very old idea, dates at least to 1956, the linguist Selig Harris, popularized later on by John Firth. A word is characterized by the company it keeps. So these are old methods in computational linguistics. I won't be using the historical American English. I'll use these two corpora in the slides. So this is the 18th century collections online, and then also British periodicals online. And I can talk more about that if you want. There's some filtering, but we're on the order of 2.6 billion words to 4.4 billion words. So these are great corpora. So to look at examples again that kind of more closely attached to Williams and Koselleck, here's just some examples of, text slices mentioning labor, and then in blue are words that show up in both of these text slices. So you can say honest work, you can also say honest labor. The price of work, the price of labor. So according to this Zelig-Harris, John Firth hypothesis, labor and work ought to show up in the data as similar because they're surrounded by similar words. You can predicate them of the same things. You can have the same adjectives modifying them, and so forth. And it turns out, indeed, and we'll talk a bit more how this works in a second, that the words most similar in meaning in a word-to-vec model of the last decade of echo, these are the closest words, the words that have the closest degree of similar words surrounding them. Like labors is the word that keeps the most company of other words as labor. Unsurprising. But we also see words like toil and drudgery in this list that we don't see here. And we see words like performance because work can mean a work of art. It means something accomplished. It has some connotations that labor does not. So we see similar words for labor and work, but some differences. Now, the way that this is really working, that these similarities are computed by looking at how far apart these words are in an embedding space. So this is a kind of 300 dimensions of this word-to-vec model are reduced just to 2 for this visualization. But if you look at where labor and work are in that model, they're very close to each other. So basically what word embedding models do is encode semantic similarity as spatial proximity. So we already have from the 50s this theory about how words that are similar in meaning ought to co-locate with similar words. And what word embedding models do is embed those words in some virtual space such that proximity within that space is also a measure of semantic similarity. So that's, a big view. I think this is, again, the 1790s. If you zoom in, you see, smaller connections, letter and letters and note, book, article, words, and then all of these are generally related to words, but within them there are closer connections. Question and argument a bit farther away, person, business, and so forth. What's even more interesting is that they also capture larger semantic differences. So if I didn't expect this, I just visualized this. And what you see is, sin, vice, depraved, degenerate, debauch, corruption, etc., versus decorum, conformity, nice, which is a positive word in the 18th century, nicety, deference, principle, etc. So these are also, accidentally from the logic of finding these collocations and embedding the words, are finding both local semantic properties, book, article, and more global semantic properties like negative to positive. So they're certainly sensitive to quite a lot of semantic information. We've already kind of looked at the history of labor, this movement from pain and trouble to a general social activity to a social abstraction of the class. I bring that up only because let's put history back into this. So instead of just training one model on the 1790s, what if I train 3 models here on the 1700s, the 50s, and the 90s? And this is where some of those other charts really come from. So labor in the 1700s has toiling, which falls out in this list. That's why it's red. Drudgery is added. These fall out. And what you get at the end of the 1790s are indeed these more economic words. Earning, work, earn, and so forth. So this is one piece of this whole kind of method is training slices of the corpus. Instead of training it on all of echo, train it on a particular decade at a time and look at how the data changes for a word over those decades. Here's another one, commerce, which in the early 18th century basically meant conversation, or you can have commerce with someone, versus, again, this kind of economic abstraction related to agriculture, manufacture, export, etc. So that's just, looking at 3, but we can kind of, scale that up and look at decade models over time. And so here are, again, the most similar words to labor. And what's interesting is kind of finding these similar words that have histories. So painful starts to fall out of labor. And Williams talks about that, that in the way in which that oldest sense of labor survives is in the labor of childbirth. We still say that. But generally, labor refers to something closer to wages. And so, and then you also see words that are not trending at all. Laboring. Doesn't really matter what labor means. It's a gerund, laboring. Commerce, again, from correspondence to industry and so forth. Here's culture again. Agriculture drops out in association and education picks up. So we expect to see some of these trends. But again, we're just now falling back into looking at individual words. And we haven't yet got a method for measuring the degree of change. And that's where this very cool article from 2016 by a computational linguist at Stanford, Cultural Shift or Linguistic Drift, comparing two computational measures of semantic change. And if people are big like Word2Vec people, you know that some people have tried, because when you train one model and train another model, you get these embedding spaces that are untranslatable. There's 300 virtual dimensions, which mean nothing except within that model. So you can't directly compare a word's position in model X to model Y unless you do some things. So there are ways to align the vector spaces such that you can do that. Or what he suggests is to construct these kind of synthetic vectors. So if here is a list of the 10 words most similar to commerce in the 1700s to 1750s, such that both words that appear in both decades and both these lists are put into each of these lists. I didn't say that well. Instead of just taking the 10 words from the 1700s and the 10 words from the 1750s, we basically merge those lists. And then we get the similarity of commerce to even the words that weren't in the top 10 for the first one. So colonies was not in the top 10, but we get its similarity anyway. Then with these similarity scores, you can take the cosine distance because now these are translatable. It's just a very small vector of like 15 words, say, with the same values or with the same words that are key to those values, and you can take this cosine similarity between these models. So this is a measure of how far apart these two lists are. And that's a kind of operationalization of semantic the degree of semantic change. And so here are some words that supposedly changed quite a lot. So here's circulation. It's really gross, but in the 18th century, it's more often anatomical. So digestion, fluid, perspiration, fermentation, nerve, moisture, respiration, and so forth. Yet again, we see this kind of social abstraction, economic abstraction from publication, currency, periodical distribution, press. So we're able to kind of find words that change more to words that change less. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a second. But now, in order to kind of put that into the Zottl-Zeit hypothesis, we kind of also want to know when they change. Specific, like which decades, when do they change? And this is a very interesting method I completely stole from from a 2015 article, and I know we have someone who works on music, so I'm curious what they think here. But they took the musical properties of many songs, timbre, melody, as well as the lyrics and some text properties, and calculated the similarity of music from 20, here's the 2010s, here's the 19, how similar is the 1960 music compared to the 2000s? And so music, this white line here is just 1960 to 1960, 1970 to 1970. Of course, it's very similar to itself. And as you get further, it's less similar. But what they argue is that you can see in this data moments of similarity. So this kind of block, music is fairly similar to itself. But then there's a so-called revolution here, to another kind of mode of self-similarity in music, and then another one. And they use this metric called foot novelty to pinpoint these moments of change So they're pinpointing this moment and this moment. And so what I wanted to do is do something similar for semantics. So we already have this notion of semantic distance. This word circulation is further apart in its two instantiations than is insurrection. So we already have a notion of semantic distance. We can do something like this again. So here's station. We've already looked at this. Starting around the mid-19th century, station has a self-similarity to itself. It's about railway stations. Before that, it had a kind of general consensus of meaning, and there's quite a strong break at this moment. Other words don't have quite as strong a break, but you can still see it. I mean, so there's something right here in the earlier 19th century where culture is starting, as Williams was saying, to pick up those more abstract notions. And what we can do, to go back to station, is to, just as they did, find this foot novelty. And so I just kind of overlaid these graphs. This is exactly where station has its most novelty, its most difference from what came before and what came after. So we're able to pinpoint these moments of change. And there's a way to kind of also measure statistical significance by permuting, just scrambling this matrix along like a 50-year unit, scramble it, and see if you still get the same difference as you did before. So here you would, this is already looking pretty scrambled. It wouldn't be statistically significant, but if you scramble this, you'll miss this dark upper left, dark lower right. You won't see that anymore. And so by comparing the real thing to the scrambled thing, you can get a sense of statistical significance. So station is significant here, culture around 1825, liberal. And so, with this method, we can also start to look for more words that change at this time. So slave, this is very interesting, the abolition movement in the 1780s is picking off. Slave before, basically, it's used often in poetry, it just means someone in a dependent position. Whereas given the rise of abolitionist newspapers and abolitionist discourse, slave means slave. It's referring to the transatlantic slave trade, the American slavery context. Yeah, I mean, we can tell stories about each of these words. I mean, sensibility, it's a very important word in the 18th century, goes through quite a lot of evolution. Demand, this is another a word that's economizing. Radical means something different given the French Revolution and some of the revolutionary periods. These are fairly new words, being theorized, like evolution by Darwin, socialism, and some other words. Broadcast, again, we see a kind of technological change. This, originally refers to the broadcasting of seeds and then radio and television waves. So you find a range of types of change, some technological, some new coinages, so, again, more technological, some political, and some kind of semantic. And, one interesting question of this type of research is whether there are really hard distinctions between those kinds of change. I mean, maybe there aren't. Like maybe technological change is more fluidly related to semantic change than it appears. I don't know. Because it's hard to pinpoint some of these. I mean, exactly what they would fall down to. So here's the graph that kind of tries to address this hypothesis. So if we take a bunch of words and ask where their pivot points are, if any, where do those pivot points fall? And so here are words only with significant pivot points. Here's the turn of the 19th century, 1800. And here's, one definition of the Zahlzeit, 1770 to 1830. And what you do see is, in fact, a large number of words pivot in this period. So I do think that this is some kind of substantiation of Koselleck's hypothesis, that there are an unusual number of words changing at this period. What's interesting is you also see another one in the 20th century, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's what I try to write about in this piece, that maybe we're seeing Zahlzeit 10, multiple semantic, multiple moments of semantic change. It's not, this is a very important one at the turn of the 19th century, but maybe this is something that happens more often than we think. Okay, so all of that was based on notions of degree of semantic change. I also want to talk about directions of change, because we had those two hypotheses. One, that words change a lot at this period. Two, that they change in a particular direction toward abstraction. So can vectors get us that too? Can word embedding models get us that too? Um, and the way they can is through subtraction. So because these are vectors, you can subtract them. So if I take labor and I subtract work, I cancel out the semantics that they share, and I leave only what's unique about work. So all of a sudden, I cancel out, I leave only what is distinctive of labor here. And so again, I get these fatigue, pains, penury, rigors, excessive, that notion of the pain of labor. Whereas if I do this with work minus labor, I get only the connotations specific to work. And so you get treatise, preface, masterpiece, etc., because work can be used in that context, but not labor. What's interesting is you can even plot words along this type of subtraction. So here's woman minus man. And, at the far reaches, girl, maid, woman, etc. At the far reaches here, man, mankind, etc. But what's interesting is we're not just looking at the top 10 words here. We're plotting a whole range of words and asking where they fall on this subtraction, where they fall on the axis, the vector between these two words. And so this is interesting because basically, you could argue that what this represents, this vector of woman to man, is something like gendering of language. It's not the word woman. It's not the word man. It's the semantic relation between them. And what that allows you to do is find words, and this is important to us in the digital humanities, find words that are biased. So eyes is more feminine, government is more masculine. And people at Google or whoever who are working on this are trying to fix these biases, which is important when it's used for general purposes. But us as researchers, this is exactly what we're interested in, right? It's like the history of discourse, gendering in one way, gendering in another way. So this vector approach lets us see something like that. So the idea here is, instead of just woman and man, what if we put on one end here a bunch of abstract words, and on the other end, a bunch of concrete words. And we see how do words slot along that subtraction, along that difference. Of course, this runs into the issue of now we have to define what an abstract or a concrete word is before we come up with our measurement of what an abstract or a concrete word is. But to the rescue comes good old methods of linguistics, starting in like 68, where people gave words to subjects, and it's still going on. There's a recent-ish study from 2019. People give you a word, belief, and ask you to rate how concrete it is. So this particular prompt is concrete words. Some words refer to things or actions in reality, which you can experience directly through one of the 5 senses. We call these concrete words. Abstract words, meanings that cannot be experienced directly, but which we, blah, 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 blah. And you ask people to rate these things. And one of the reasons I think this is interesting that psycholinguists got particularly interested in concreteness, because it correlates with a bunch of empirical brain measurements. So apparently concrete words are easier to remember, they're easier to associate. They activate different regions of the brain that are related to sense perception, whereas abstract words do not. And of course, there's also people who study childhood development of language. Concrete words generally are learned first, abstract words later. So psycholinguists got particularly interested, in fact, in concreteness. This is not even just one of the things they were studying. This is a pretty big one. And sorry, I should have explained this graph. So this is just that older study from Pavio, and then up to, I guess, this 2017 study. And then here's belief. Here's the measured concreteness. I've just standardized it. And so I've uglily colored it in blue here. And you can see belief across all these studies is an unconcrete. Elbow across all the studies is concrete. But then you get interesting kind of outliers and ambiguous words like anxiety. I mean, anxiety is sort of a feeling, it's sort of palpable, but it's also a concept. You can experience it through the senses, sort of. So you can imagine as a test subject getting confused at certain words like this and not knowing what to respond. But you certainly do see words that are kind of consistent. And so all I've done is kind of slice this off. So in order to take a bunch of abstract words as seeds to the vector, I'm just going to take a bunch of words that are a standard deviation below the average. For concrete words, take words that are a standard deviation above the average or more. And then again, we can put them back in this space. And again, this word embedding model doesn't know anything about concrete or abstract words. All I've done is color it by these words. And again, you see it clustering. So concreteness is being picked up by the model. So is abstractness. And the trick here is to get the vector between them. So we just take the centroid of these concrete words, the centroid of the abstract words, and get the vector between those centroids. Then any word, we can get its cosine similarity with that vector. So human is interesting. So up is more abstract according to the computational model, down more concrete according to the computational model, right more abstract according to this psycholinguistic study, left more concrete. So human is interestingly considered concrete by the human participants. Because I guess according to those prompts, a human is something you can experience through the senses, etc. But the way in which it's used in the 18th century is as an abstraction. It's human nature, human and the divine, human versus beasts or animals, and so forth. So I think this is an interesting lesson. Not only is the computer able to pick up on things like abstractness or concreteness, but it's picking it up as it exists in usage. And that helps us do history, right? Because then we can say, what is abstract in the 1790s? What is abstract in the 1890s? So that's what we're seeing. And again, yeah, so if we kind of make a graph similar to the one above, but instead of different empirical studies, we just put the 16th century, the 17th century, 18th, 19th, 20th, and ask for abstraction, abstractness or concreteness, in fact, here. Belief across all 5 centuries is not concrete, but there are other words that change, like culture, which begins in the 16th and 17th century as more concrete than abstract and ends up as more abstract than concrete. So, again, we're able to use Williams as a kind of gut check here to kind of make sense of certain words. Like we expect to see this. It seems like the model's working. Now, this is a complicated graph, but I really like it. So on the x-axis is what we were talking about before. This is the degree of change. The y-axis is, did it become more abstract from 1750 to 1850? If it's going up, it did. If it's going down, it became more concrete. And so we see the word culture is pretty average for how much it changed, but it is becoming more abstract. You see, this is interesting. This is the word that least changes on this list of words. So God, is the most common correlate is Jehovah in both cases. Christ, you can see how Christian these older historical corpora are. This is not any other religion, but but I just think it's really funny. It's like this transcendental signifier that Derrida talked about. So that doesn't change at all, but there are words that change quite a bit. Like as we saw, station, moving from rank, estimation, eminence to just carriages and trains. Trials becomes a metaphor at this time. It's like more often used literally. And then words that I've gotten really interested in, like value, which is basically more often a synonym for price in the 18th century. And it again becomes something more abstract, something like intrinsic value, merits, worth. And I don't have the graphs in here, but if you look at which adjectives modify value over time, more and more of them do. So you have words like moral value, aesthetic value, economic value. And this is something that Koselleck talks about, that as you get these mega singular abstractions, that they require adjectivalization. So if it's liberty, instead of liberties, which really in the feudal system, certain people had liberty X, certain other people had liberty Y. I have the liberty to use the high road, you don't. Once it's liberty, you talk about spiritual liberty, political liberty, all different kinds of liberty. And you see the same thing kind of happening with value and a bunch of other words. Okay, so this is just kind of like a different type of semantic historical space, degree of change, direction of change. Um, we can do, I don't have too many graphs like this, but you can also get where on this, the further up, the more abstract, the further down, the more concrete, and just do it across time. So commerce, I guess, because it's moving into this more economic mode of agriculture, shipments, commodities, et cetera, is becoming more concrete. And again, culture more abstract. And I think I might skip over this because it's very just, this is just became more abstract, became more concrete and more positive and negative. So I think just, I'm particularly interested in abstractness, but I think there are all sorts of semantic vectors that need historicization, gender being one, negativity being one. I mean, they're also, these things are kind of specific to people's research interests, but I think that they um, help kind of create interesting spaces to visualize history within. And then just lastly, this is the only way that I've kind of verified that I think Williams and Koselleck are mostly right, is I just took a bunch of words that change quite a lot um, uh, between, in this case, 1790 and 1830, and I tried to annotate why I think they change. So agriculture moving from practical fisheries to commercial and agricultural kind of abstracts in the sense that it's no longer even talking about the stuff of agriculture. It's talking about agriculture in its abstract mode as a part of the economy. Circulation we saw, and I'm trying to just come up with a typology for what general types of changes these are. And I still don't have a super robust method to say, aha, in fact, more words abstracted in this period than not. And in fact, I think I have the ingredients to do this, but I just haven't. But it's interesting because if you look again at that second Zeit, this 20th century moment, here are the words that changed quite a lot. And I think potentially this is partly related to changes in the corpus. So blemishes moves from inaccuracy to wrinkles and pores. So it's being used in this, skincare to solve your blemishes. Um, uh, Cleanse, it's a moral term earlier, to cleanse your soul, then it becomes lotion and tissues. Um, what else? Roots, trees, fibers, to growth and scalp. Units instead of atoms and ratios, machines and vessels. So I'm trying to think about okay, sure, we see that in the 20th century, there's another moment of change, but what kinds of change is it characterized by? And I think it is very different from this kind of moment of new abstraction in the late 18th century. And it might be responding to something more like, and I don't know if this even qualifies as semantic change, but again, like we saw how technological change bleeds into it, this might be a media change in terms of how advertisements work in periodicals, how that bends the discourse around them. So it'd be great to be able to do this on another corpus. I don't immediately know what to do for that, but I'll leave it at that. Cool. Yep. We're done. There we go. Hello, hello, hello. Um,